World War I, the first European war to be fought on an industrial scale. All wars are bloody and brutal. World War I is top of the list, killing as many men using poisonous gas, machine gun fire, prolonged artillery bombardments, enormous giant underground mines, or even huge flamethrowers. Anything was considered to get one over on your enemy. The only way to gain ground was by the use of mass offences involving hundreds of thousands of men. Both sides were so well dug in and secured in trenches, just like these ones here at Bovington Tank Museum. The success of these attacks was measured in yards rather than miles. These devastating offences created casualties on a scale that had never been seen before. The Battle of the Somme, in the summer of 1916. On the first day alone, there were 57,000 British casualties. Out of these, just over 19,000 were killed. This left 38,000 injured men. If a soldier was injured, the ordeal wasn't over. Medical capabilities aren't what they are today, and even the simplest of wounds sustained in the dirt and the horror of the trenches could be fatal. And for those that did survive, the journey home was a long way. So join us as we follow some of these World War I soldiers and discover how Dorset, with its World War I hospitals, its doctors and nurses and volunteers, played its part in their story. Behind me is the grave of Private William Crossan. It's often intrigued me how soldiers like William ended up so far from home. What is their story? How did they end up being buried so far away from their families? William was one such soldier. He was born in 1893, the son of Patrick and Catherine Crossan. He went to Mohill in 1911 and joined the 1st Battalion of the Irish Guards. The Irish Guards were shipped off to France on the 13th of the 8th of 1914 and landed at Le Havre, and they saw their first action 2 weeks later at the Battle of Mons, in which William came out unscathed. It was essential for the British that the Germans did not capture Ostend, Zeebrugge, Boulogne, Calais and Dunkirk, as these channel ports were essential in moving troops and supplies into France and onto the front line. This is why Ypres was so important, as it was the crossroads to these ports. Over the war, 600,000 men would lose their lives on both sides fighting for this strategic location. From Mons, the Irish Guards marched to a small town on the outskirts of Ypres, from where they became embroiled in the first part of the Battle of Ypres, and this is where William's luck ran out, and he was badly wounded, probably from artillery fire. Unfortunately, William doesn't recover from his wounds and now resides in a Dorset churchyard. Despite his home being back in Ireland, in William's case, it's here in Sherborne. This is the story for many soldiers that never recovered from their wounds. There are war graves in the UK of soldiers from all over the Allied countries, some from as far afield as Australia, New Zealand, India, or in William's case, Ireland. Those soldiers who succumbed to their wounds were buried in cemeteries where they died, an arrangement that was consistent throughout the First World War, as returning dead soldiers to their hometowns or countries was far too complex and expensive. so invariably they would end up in a small churchyard somewhere just like this one in Dorset. This is the Yeatman Hospital in Sherborne, and this is where William spent the last days of his life, probably just being made comfortable until he died. William's story reflects that of many soldiers that were injured and travelled the long road back from the front line to hospitals here in Britain, following a system that was put in place to deal with the vast amount of casualties. These are the Commonwealth war graves at Melcombe Regis in Weymouth. This is where Anzac troops are buried, those men who unfortunately were never able to make their way home. Australian and New Zealand troops were known as Anzacs. They suffered terrible losses during World War I. Between the years of 1914 and 1918, many of them were brought here to Weymouth to recover from their wounds and recuperate. There was a huge influx of troops at the beginning of 1916 after the Gallipoli campaign. This is where the British had tried to force its way up the Dardanelles Straits to Constantinople and put pressure on the Ottoman Empire. This is the site of the Sydney Groves Memorial Hall, and during World War I, this was a military hospital. Many of the Anzac troops would have been treated here for their wounds. All that remains now of the hall are these two plaques. Recovering Anzac troops who had returned from the front line would spend their days here on Weymouth Beach relaxing. They affectionately knew it as Way Aussie. I'm just driving in the suburbs of Weymouth at the moment, and I'm on the old West Ham military camp. So this is a housing estate that is here now, and the streets are all aptly named. We've got Adelaide Crescent, Sydney Street, Melba Street, Perth Street. They were named in honour of the Anzacs that fought during the First World War. This is Netley Marsh, and the chapel here is all that is left of the vast military hospital that was built in 1856. It stretched for over a quarter of a mile and was set in 27 acres of land. After the disastrous failings of looking after the wounded during the Crimean War, which caused a public outcry, the RMC, the Royal Army Medical Corps, was formed, coming to full fruition in 1898, and was very efficient for the time. And World War I allowed them to start to perfect a process that ultimately was responsible for saving hundreds of thousands of lives. During the early days of World War I, casualties would arrive on hospital ships at Southampton docks. Then they would be taken by train to here, Netley Hospital. On arrival, they would consist of men from all different regiments and units. The triage system would send men that needed urgent medical treatment to hospitals nearby in Dorset, Hampshire, Wiltshire and Somerset. Medical orderlies would assess the patient's condition, and then RMC staff would let them know what hospitals had free beds. William was repatriated for treatment, most likely from Calais, and records show he landed at Southampton. He was triaged here at Netley Hospital and sent by train to Sherborne. The process started with regimental aid posts, or RAPs. They were set up in small spaces such as communication trenches, ruined buildings, dugouts or deep shell holes, maybe only 20 metres from the front line. The RAP had no holding capacity, and here, often in appalling conditions, battle wounds would be cleaned and dressed, pain relief administered and basic first aid given. If fit enough, you were sent back to the line. If not, you would be sent on to an advanced dressing station or ADS. These were set up and run as part of the FAs or field ambulances and would be sited about 400 yards behind the RAPs in ruined buildings, underground dugouts and bunkers. In fact, anywhere that offered some protection from shell fire and air attack. The ADS also had no holding capacity, and though better equipped than the RAPs, could still only provide limited medical care. Here the sick and wounded were further treated so they could be returned to their units or, alternatively, were taken by horse-drawn or motor transport to a casualty clearing station. In times of heavy fighting, the ADS could be overwhelmed by the volume of casualties arriving, and often wounded men had to lie in the open on stretchers, with the battle raging around them. Ultimately, the goal was to get the casualty to the CCS, or Casualty Clearing Station, which would usually be located just beyond the range of enemy artillery, and often near transportation facilities like railways. Here they had the capabilities to perform life-saving operations. Its role was to retain all serious cases that were unfit for further travel, to treat and return slight cases to their unit, and evacuate all others to the base hospitals.
During the opening of the Somme offensive in 1916, on the 1st to the 4th of July, 63 trainloads of casualties arrived at Boscombe Station in Bournemouth. 2 days later, on the 7th, 6,174 more casualties arrived at Southampton docks for dispersal to local hospitals across the local counties. However, as the war progressed and more casualties arrived back in Britain, hospital trains were taking them to newly opened hospitals across the country, some as far as the Highlands in Scotland.
Base hospitals were located in France, well away from the fighting. They were located near the Army's principal bases at Boulogne, Le Havre and Rouen. More than half the men that arrived at these hospitals were sent back to the UK for further treatment or to convalesce.
So the hospital system was organised in two ways, really. There was the military hospitals, which were run by the Royal Army Medical Corps, and that was a proper bona fide regiment of the Army, the British Army. And they would deal with the more serious cases, the surgical cases and cases that needed ongoing treatment and major intervention. And then there were the voluntary hospitals that were run by the Voluntary Aid Detachment, which was the Red Cross and St John's Ambulance. And they were places where people could go to convalesce, and so it was envisaged that there wouldn't be any further major surgical intervention needed for these people. They were on the mend, or they were on their way to dying and needed somewhere comfortable to go. So that was the major difference. It was one was medical and a surgical intervention, and the other one was a quieter, happier place. And a lot of the men really enjoyed these VAD hospitals. VAD stood for Voluntary Aid Detachment, and it was the part of the organisation of the Red Cross and St John's Ambulance who began to organise this nursing support in 1909, before there was any war breaking out. And so it was to have an emergency standby. The government needed to have contingency plans. And by 1911, it had grown into a formidable organisation. And again, it was nearly all volunteers. So it was the great and the good. And an awful lot of Girl Scouts, in fact, volunteered for VAD nursing roles. So the nurses were all volunteers. They weren't surgically trained, but they knew the basic caring principles. In the surrounding area of Wimborne, which was known as District 6, there were 7 voluntary aid detachment hospitals scattered around. There was quite a small one, 4 beds in Ferndown, and much larger ones in the town centre. So they were based at Bowcroft House and at the old infirmary in the workhouse. If somebody died in one of these hospitals, they'd be buried in the local cemetery. And in Wimborne, we have a number of graves where they are Commonwealth War Grave headstones, and they are of people who died here either during training or during their time in one of the hospitals. It was quite important that people were buried near where they fell, and that became a very important principle for the Imperial War Graves Commission, which later evolved into the Commonwealth War Graves Commission.
Here we are at Wimborne Cemetery. In front of me I have two men, Private Barrow and Private Dennick, who didn't survive their wounds and died well after the war had ended. Here in Dorset, men coming back from the front line were from all different regiments, battalions and countries, and were treated at hospitals right across Dorset. When war broke out in 1914, Brockenhurst was selected as one of the first places to have a temporary military hospital. Its proximity to the dockyards in Southampton and its railway links meant it was ideal to receive injured soldiers. The first soldiers to be treated here were Indian troops of the 3rd and 7th Division. They'd been sent over to France to help out the expeditionary force. Over 3,000 of them were treated here in Brockenhurst before they were eventually sent to Egypt later on in the war. 3 of them are buried here. One of them is Suka Kalu. He was sent over with the Indian Army and worked in the military hospital as a latrine sweeper. He died on January the 12th, 1915, and the local parish raised money for his headstone. When the Indian troops left here for Egypt, it was taken over by Anzac's troops, primarily New Zealand troops. Many of them that didn't survive their wounds are buried here in the cemetery. They couldn't be further from home. William died of his wounds on the 2nd of November 1914 at the Yeatman Hospital in Sherborne, having played his part in halting the German advance to the coast. His story reflects those of hundreds of thousands of displaced men who lost their lives and ended up in churchyards in small villages right across Britain, far from their homes and their families. So if you're strolling through an English churchyard and you come across a soldier's grave who must have bore the most unimaginable hardships in defence of their nation, spare a thought for the sacrifice they made in the Great War. And remember the 8 million military personnel and 6.6 million civilians that lost their lives.